The grand ballroom of Coldwater Hall in Newport was bright with the light of 300 wax candles when the winter masquerade began. The floor was made of white marble that reflected the silk dresses of women moving in slow circles. The air smelled of expensive winter green and burning wood from the two large fireplaces at either end of the hall. Guests wore velvet masks with gold trim and laughed softly behind painted fans, speaking in the quiet, careful voices of high society. At the edge of the crowded floor, sitting at a dark walnut piano that everyone had ignored for 2 hours, was Audrey Finch. She wore a plain black dress made of thick cotton and lace, with no jewelry and no mask to hide her face. Her brown hair was pulled back into a simple knot at her neck, and her hands rested quietly in her lap as she watched the dancers move past her like colorful shadows in the candlelight. Blair Harrington walked over to the piano with a glass of lemonade in her hand and a small, tight smile on her face. Her white dress was covered in silver embroidery that caught the light every time she moved, and she stood in a way that made sure the nearby guests could see her clearly. She stopped right in front of Audrey and tapped her fan against the side of the instrument, leaning down slightly so her voice would carry over the sound of the crowd. She told Audrey to keep her music very simple tonight because the master of the house did not like anything loud or complicated. She said a basic waltz would be fine, just enough to fill the silence between the dances so people would not have to listen to nothing. Audrey looked up into Blair's blue eyes and kept her face perfectly still, and nodded once before saying she understood exactly what was required of her. Across the room, standing by a tall window that looked out into the dark winter night, was Nicholas Drake. He was 31 years old, but his skin was as white as carved marble, and his hair was completely white, falling in clean lines around a face that looked like it had been shaped by a winter frost. He wore a black coat with silver buttons and a dark gray vest, holding a glass of red wine that he never actually raised to his lips. His dark eyes moved slowly over the crowd of guests, looking at them with the cold patience of someone who had watched the same dance happen for 100 years. His old friend, Arthur Pendleton, stepped up beside him with a small smile and murmured that the girl in black was about to begin her performance. Arthur noted that Blair had just given the girl orders to play something short and forgettable so the guests could get back to their conversations without any real distraction. Nicholas did not answer his friend, but his gaze drifted toward the corner where the dark piano stood. Audrey placed her fingers on the keys, took one slow breath, and struck the first chord with a force that surprised the entire room. It was not a light waltz for a winter evening, but a heavy, low sound that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards and into the shoes of every person standing there. The loud talking in the ballroom died instantly, and a woman who had been laughing mid-sentence stopped and pressed her handkerchief to her mouth. The three violinists who had been tuning their instruments by the door went completely quiet, as if someone had walked over and taken their bows away. Nicholas turned his head fully toward the piano, his dark eyes narrowing as the cold glass in his pale hand began to frost over at the rim. The music that followed was dark and full of a strange, quiet power that did not belong in a standard ballroom. It moved through the large hall like a cold wind from the ocean, rising and falling with a steady rhythm that made the heavy chandeliers swing slightly on their iron chains. Audrey kept her eyes fixed on her hands, her fingers moving across the white keys with a speed and certainty that came from years of practice in empty rooms. The melody felt like a secret that had been kept in a dark place for too long, full of a quiet grief that made the velvet-masked guests step closer to each other without knowing why. Nicholas stood completely still by the window, his white hair catching the silver light of the moon outside, as he watched the young woman in black play a song he had not heard since his own childhood. This unexpected night did not happen by accident, but was built slowly over the course of 6 long weeks in the freezing cold of a New England winter. It began on the first Tuesday of November, when Audrey Finch arrived at the Gable estate in Newport with nothing but a single wooden trunk and 2 small hat boxes. Her father had died in the spring after a long illness that had taken the last of their family's money, and her mother had passed away many years before that. Having no other relatives to turn to, Audrey had written a letter to Lady Gable, a distant aunt who lived in a large brick house near the harbor. Lady Gable had offered her a small room at the top of the house, not out of kindness, but because she felt a vague family duty to help a girl with no money and no other place to go. Audrey was 23 years old, with quiet brown eyes that spent more time watching the world than talking to it, and a gentle way of walking that never made a sound on the hardwood floors. The room she was given was on the 3rd floor, facing north where the sun never reached, making the small space feel cold and gray even during the middle of the day. It contained a narrow iron bed, a small wooden washstand, and a single window that looked out over the slate roofs of the nearby stables. Blair Harrington, who was the daughter of Lady Gable's closest friend, and had lived in the house for 2 full years, made sure Audrey knew her place from the very first morning. Blair was beautiful in a sharp, bright way, and she liked having Audrey around because her plain black dresses made Blair's colorful silk gowns look much more expensive by comparison. On her 2nd morning in the house, Audrey had found an old upright piano in the back parlor and had begun to touch the keys softly when Blair walked into the room. Blair had smiled the way a cat smiles at a mouse and remarked that it was very convenient that Audrey knew how to play a little. She told Audrey that Lady Gable's friends always enjoyed having some soft music in the background while they drank their tea or played cards in the afternoon. From that day on, Audrey became a regular part of the house's social life, sitting at the piano for hours while the other women talked about the local news and the upcoming winter balls. Nobody ever thanked her when she finished playing, and she was never asked to sit at the table with the guests, but she told herself it was enough to have a warm roof over her head. She repeated this to herself every night when she went up to her cold room on the 3rd floor, looking at her red fingers in the yellow light of her single candle. She tried to be grateful for the food she did not have to pay for, but each week that passed made the silence of her room feel heavier and harder to bear. The only person who seemed to notice her as a human being was Iris Campbell, a young woman with bright gray eyes, who was visiting her family in the house next door. Iris had heard Audrey play during a small card party and had walked straight over to the piano when the song ended, asking why she had stopped so quickly. When Audrey replied that she had been told not to make too much noise, Iris had looked toward Blair with a small, angry frown that showed she did not care for the rules of the house. By the 3rd week of November, Iris had become a regular visitor to the parlor, sitting on the small bench beside Audrey whenever the other guests were busy with their games. She did not talk about dresses or the young men of the town, but instead asked Audrey about her father and the music he had taught her when they lived in their small house in the countryside. Audrey found herself talking more than she usually did, explaining how her father would sit beside her for hours, guiding her small hands across the keys until her fingers knew the notes by heart. It was the first real friendship Audrey had found since moving to the coastal town, and she held onto it carefully, knowing how easily a good thing could be taken away by Lady Gable if she became too loud or too noticeable. While the women spent their days preparing for the winter social season, the rest of the town was busy talking about Nicholas Drake and the large estate he owned at the edge of the cliffs. The people of Newport spoke about the master of Coldwater Hall in quiet whispers, noting that he never came to the market during the day and was only seen after the sun had gone down. The older servants in the neighborhood whispered that his pale skin and white hair had not changed since their own childhood, and that his family had lived in the cold stone house for more than 100 years without ever growing old. They said he was a king of a dark, forgotten lineage that had come from across the ocean, a creature who lived on the cold winter air and had no need for the company of mortal men. Arthur Pendleton had spent 3 days trying to convince Nicholas to open his doors for a grand winter masquerade, sitting in the dark study of Coldwater Hall while the master looked out at the gray sea. Arthur argued that the town expected a ball, and that hosting the event would keep the local leaders from asking too many questions about why the curtains of the house were always drawn during the day. Nicholas had listened in silence, his pale fingers resting on the arm of his leather chair, before finally agreeing to allow the party on one condition. He stated that he would remain in the room for exactly 1 hour to greet the guests, and then he would return to his private quarters on the upper floor, leaving Arthur to manage the rest of the evening on his own. What Nicholas did not know was that Lady Gable had already volunteered her entire household to help prepare the large house for the arrival of the 300 guests. This meant that on a cold Sunday afternoon in early December, Audrey found herself sitting in the back of a wooden wagon along with Blair, Iris, and 3 kitchen maids as they drove up the long avenue of oak trees toward Coldwater Hall. The house was enormous, built of gray stone that looked almost blue against the winter sky, with tall, narrow windows that showed no light from within. The air around the estate felt colder than it did in the town, and the wind from the cliffs made a low, whistling sound through the empty branches of the old trees as the wagon stopped by the kitchen door. Lady Gable assigned Audrey to work with the maids in the lower rooms, carrying heavy bundles of pine branches and red berries to decorate the wide stone fireplaces and the iron railings of the main staircase. Audrey worked quietly for 3 days, doing exactly what she was told by the older housekeeper and keeping her head down whenever the other guests walked through the halls. She found the house strangely beautiful despite its coldness, with its dark oak paneling and heavy wool carpets that swallowed the sound of her footsteps as she moved from room to room. The building felt old and solid, like a castle that had been built to keep the rest of the world out, and she felt a strange sense of peace in its quiet, empty corridors. On the 4th evening, after the other maids had gone down to the kitchen for their supper, Audrey took a wrong turn while looking for the linen closet on the 2nd floor. The north wing of the house was darker than the rest, with long rows of closed doors and oil lamps that had not been lit for years. She walked slowly, holding her single candle ahead of her, until she felt a strange vibration in the floorboards beneath her boots. It was a low, humming sound that seemed to come from the very walls of the building, like the distant echo of a deep voice speaking in an empty room. She followed the sound to the end of the hall, where she found a heavy oak door that was slightly open, showing a sliver of pale moonlight on the floor inside. Audrey pushed the door open and stepped into a large room with 2 tall windows that looked out over the ocean. In the center of the floor stood a magnificent concert grand piano, its dark wood covered by a gray linen sheet that had grown thick with dust over the years. Shelves of old sheet music lined the walls, and several loose pages lay on the floor as if someone had dropped them while leaving the room in a hurry. She walked over to the instrument and lifted the dust cover, revealing a set of white keys that were perfectly clean and cold to the touch. She sat down on the leather bench, placed her hands on the keys without making a sound, and felt a sudden warmth return to her fingers for the first time in weeks. She pressed a single key, and the note that came from the piano was so deep and clear that it seemed to fill the entire room, echoing off the stone walls long after her finger had left the wood. It was an instrument of incredible quality, far better than the old parlor piano at Lady Gable's house, and Audrey could not resist the urge to play a short melody her father had written. As she played, she closed her eyes and forgot about her cold room, her dependency on her aunt, and the sharp words of Blair Harrington. She did not know that Nicholas Drake was standing in the dark shadow of the hallway outside, his white hair catching the faint light of her candle as he listened to the music, with his head pressed against the wall. Nicholas had not entered that room since the night his mother died 40 years ago, and the sound of the piano made something move in his cold chest that he had not felt in a very long time. He stood in the dark for a long minutes, his pale skin looking almost blue in the moonlight as he listened to the girl play with a skill that did not belong to a common servant. He did not open the door or let her know he was there, but when she finally stopped and blew out her candle to leave, he stepped back into the shadows of the secondary hallway, watching her walk past him with a look of quiet wonder in his dark eyes. The next morning, Audrey returned to her work in the grand ballroom, but her mind remained in the dark room at the end of the north wing. She could still feel the weight of the piano keys beneath her fingers, and she found herself counting the hours until the rest of the house would go to sleep so she could return to the secret space. Polly Kent, a young maid with red hair and a bright face who had been assigned to help Audrey with her dresses, noticed that she was unusually quiet as they carried a basket of silver candlesticks up the main stairs. Polly leaned closer and whispered that the staff was talking about the master again, saying he had been seen walking the north corridor until 3 o'clock in the morning. Polly said, The night watchman had passed the old music room and had seen a light under the door, but when he went to check, he found nobody inside except for the scent of winter flowers and a single drop of cold water on the floorboards. She warned Audrey to stay away from that part of the house after dark, because the old stories said the Drake family did not like anyone touching their old belongings, especially the things that had belonged to the master's mother. Audrey thanked the young maid for her advice, but did not say anything about her own late-night visit, keeping her eyes fixed on the silver in her hands as they reached the top of the stairs. That night, after the clock in the main hall struck midnight, Audrey crept out of her small room and made her way down the dark corridor with her candle held low against the floor. The house was completely silent, except for the sound of the winter wind against the glass, and she reached the heavy oak door without meeting a single soul. She entered the music room, shut the door quietly behind her, and walked over to the shelves to look through the old music books by the light of her single flame. On the top shelf, hidden behind a stack of German waltzes, she found a small book bound in dark red leather with no writing on its spine. She took the book to the piano and opened it to find a series of handwritten musical notes, written in a dark ink that had turned brown with age. The music was complex and strange, with long lines of chords that looked more like an architectural plan than a standard song for a winter dance. Audrey placed her fingers on the cold keys and began to read the first page, moving her hands slowly at first, as she tried to understand the rhythm of the piece. The melody was unlike anything she had ever played before, full of a deep, driving energy that felt like the movement of the sea during a great winter storm. As she played into the second hour, she did not notice that the temperature in the room had dropped significantly, or that her own breath was forming small white clouds in the dark air before her face. She was completely lost in the music, her fingers moving with a sudden lightness that made her forget the coldness of the stone room and the fatigue in her arms. In the hallway outside, Nicholas Drake stood with his pale hands folded behind his back, his dark eyes fixed on the wood of the door as the song moved through the walls and into his frozen heart. He recognized the melody immediately. It was a private song written by his grandfather 2 centuries ago, a piece of music that had never been written down in any public book. He closed his eyes and let the music wash over him, remembering the days when his family had lived in the great castles of Europe before the long shadows had taken them. The girl's playing was not perfect, but it had a human warmth to it that made the old notes feel alive again, as if the person who wrote them was standing in the room beside her. Nicholas raised his hand to knock on the door, his long, pale fingers hovering an inch from the dark wood for a long moment before he slowly lowered them back to his side. He knew that if he entered the room, he would frighten her away, and he did not want the music to stop. For 5 nights in a row, Audrey returned to the music room to practice the handwritten piece until her hands knew every change in the melody without having to look at the brown ink. She felt a strange connection to the unknown composer, as if the person who wrote the notes had felt the same loneliness she felt every day in Lady Gable's large house. She did not see Nicholas during these hours, but she often felt a strange chill in the air right before she started to play, a cold presence that seemed to sit in the empty velvet chair by the window until the final note died away into the darkness. During the daytime, Audrey noticed that Nicholas had begun to appear in the lower rooms of the house more frequently than before, standing in the shadows of the library or the billiard room, while the guests were busy with their preparations. He never spoke to anyone except Arthur, but his dark eyes always found Audrey whenever she walked through the room with her bundles of pine or silver. Blair Harrington noticed the master's silent attention as well, and it made her angry that a white-haired noble would look at a penniless orphan when she herself was wearing her finest dresses every afternoon. Blair waited until the Friday morning before the ball to make her move, standing at the breakfast table in front of Lady Gable and 3 other local hostesses who had come to discuss the final arrangements. She announced that she had found the perfect piece for Audrey to play during the musical interlude between the first 2 dances of the masquerade. She held up a thin sheet of music and said it was a simple waltz from a local printer, something short and easy that would not take up too much time or tire the ears of the noble guests. Lady Gable looked up from her tea, nodded her approval, and told Audrey to make sure she practiced it thoroughly, so she would not embarrass the family in front of the master. Audrey took the thin sheet of music from Blair's hand without saying a word, looking down at the simple notes that any child could have played after a single week of lessons. She knew that Blair had chosen this piece deliberately to make her look like a common amateur in front of the 300 guests, ensuring that nobody would pay any real attention to her or her music. She carried the paper up to her room and threw it onto the small wooden table by her bed, her heart burning with a quiet anger that she had not felt since her father's death. She remembered how her father had told her never to hide her talent, to make smaller people feel more comfortable, and she decided at that moment that she would not play Blair's simple waltz. That night, she went back to the north wing for the last time before the ball, her feet moving with a sudden determination that made her candle flicker wildly in the dark corridor. She sat down at the grand piano, opened the dark red leather book to the very first page, and began to play the handwritten piece from start to finish without stopping. She played until her arms ached and her fingertips were red from the pressure of the cold keys, putting all her anger, her grief, and her quiet hope into the keys. She knew she was making a dangerous choice that could cause Lady Gable to throw her out of the house the next morning, but she did not care anymore. Nicholas Drake sat in his dark study on the floor below, listening to the music through the stone ceiling, with his eyes fixed on the small fire in the hearth. The flames were blue and low, giving off no real heat, but they cast long dancing shadows across his white face as he followed every note of his grandfather's forgotten song. He could hear the change in the girl's playing tonight. It was no longer hesitant or careful, but full of a human strength that seemed to defy the coldness of the great house and the long centuries of silence that had kept his family apart from the world. He raised his glass of wine and let a single drop fall into the fire, watching the blue flame turn a dark crimson as the final chord ended. The next evening, the carriages began to arrive at Coldwater Hall. At 6 o'clock, their iron wheels making a loud grinding sound on the gravel drive as the 300 guests descended into the winter cold. The main entrance was bright with the light of dozens of torches, and 2 tall footmen in silver livery opened the heavy doors to welcome the visitors into the warm hall. The guests wore elaborate silk masks shaped like birds, wolves, and mythical beasts, their colorful clothes creating a brilliant wave of movement against the gray stone walls of the ballroom. Audrey stood by the small door behind the piano, her black dress looking dark and sharp amidst the sea of gold and silver gowns that filled the room. Iris Campbell found her there just before the first dance began, reaching out to take Audrey's cold hand in her own with a warm, encouraging smile. Iris told her that she looked beautiful despite the simplicity of her dress, and that she had heard about Blair's plan to make her play the simple waltz from the town printer. She looked into Audrey's dark eyes and whispered that she knew Audrey was going to do something else, because she had that same look her father used to have before he performed in the big concert halls. Audrey managed a small smile and thanked her friend for her trust, feeling a sudden surge of warmth in her chest that helped steady her trembling fingers. At the far side of the ballroom, Nicholas Drake stood with Arthur Pendleton, his stark white hair standing out clearly against the dark velvet of his formal coat. He wore no mask to cover his pale white face, and his dark eyes were fixed on the piano in the corner where the young woman in black had just taken her seat. Arthur murmured that the guests were getting restless for the musical interlude, and that Blair Harrington had been telling everyone that the performance would be short and sweet so the dancing could continue without delay. Nicholas did not look at his friend, but his hand tightened around the silver handle of his walking stick until the metal groaned under the pressure of his grip. Blair walked over to the piano one final time, her silver-embroidered dress rustling loudly against the marble floor as she stopped beside Audrey's seat. She leaned down and whispered that she hoped Audrey remembered her instructions to keep the music short and simple, because the master was already looking bored by the whole affair and would not tolerate any long-winded displays. Audrey did not look up at her, keeping her eyes fixed on the black and white keys before her, as she nodded once to indicate she had heard the words. Blair turned away with a satisfied smile, confident that she had secured her victory in front of the entire assembly of Newport High society. The ballroom was filled with a loud roar of conversation, and the clink of glasses as the 300 guests waited for the music to begin, nobody paying any real attention to the quiet girl in black. Audrey took one deep, cold breath, raised her hands above the keys, and struck the opening chord of the dark red leather book with all the force in her small body. The sound was so immense and unexpected that it seemed to strike the walls of the hall like a physical blow, causing several guests to drop their glasses onto the marble floor with a loud shatter. The talking stopped instantly, a sudden and complete silence falling over the great room as every eye turned toward the piano in the corner. Audrey did not look up to see their reactions, but instead let her fingers fly across the keys as the ancient melody took hold of her body moving with the rhythm of the complex song. The music rose through the high ceiling of the ballroom like a gathering storm, full of a deep, dark beauty that none of these people had ever heard in their polite parlor gatherings. It was a song of old winter nights, of long journeys across cold seas, and of a love that had outlived the very stars in the sky. Nicholas Drake stepped forward from the shadow of the window, his white face illuminated by the candles as he walked slowly toward the edge of the crowded floor, his dark eyes burning with a sudden, intense light. The 300 guests stood like stone statues in the center of the ballroom, their colorful masks looking strange and empty in the bright candlelight as the music moved through them. A few elderly women pressed their hands to their hearts, their eyes filling with tears as the melody reminded them of things they had lost many years ago in their own youth. The violinists by the door stood with their mouths slightly open, recognizing the incredible difficulty of the piece and the flawless skill with which the young woman was playing it. Blair Harrington stood near the fireplace, her face turning as white as her dress as she realized that her plan to humiliate Audrey had failed, completely in a matter of seconds. Audrey kept her head low, her entire world shrinking down to the black and white keys and the dark red book that lived in her memory. She reached the second movement of the piece, where the melody turned from a storm into a quiet, aching conversation between the high and low notes, like two voices calling to each other across a wide, dark river. She played with a human tenderness that made the large stone hall feel small and intimate, as if she were alone in the room with only one other soul to hear her. Nicholas stopped 10 feet away from the piano, his long, white fingers resting on the back of a gilded chair, as he watched her face with an expression that was no longer cold or distant. The final movement of the song was the fastest and most demanding of all, requiring both her hands to move in perfect opposition across the full length of the keyboard like two birds caught in a winter wind. Audrey did not hesitate or slow down, but instead pushed her fingers harder into the keys, letting the final chords rise to a magnificent, deafening roar that seemed to shake the very glass in the tall windows. When the last note finally ended, she lifted her hands from the wood and let them drop into her lap, her body trembling with exhaustion as the echo of the music died away into the high corners of the great hall. For 3 long seconds, nobody in the ballroom moved or made a sound, the silence so deep that the burning of the wax candles could be heard clearly from the chandeliers above. Then, a single pair of hands began to clap near the center of the room, followed quickly by another, until the entire hall erupted into a loud, roaring wave of applause that Newport society had never given to any performer before. Guests took off their masks to see the girl better, shouting their approval and asking each other who this extraordinary musician was and where she had been hidden all winter. The elderly hostesses who had helped Blair plan the evening were now clapping with both hands, their faces bright with an excitement they had not felt in years. Nicholas Drake did not clap, but he began to walk through the parting crowd toward the piano, his white hair and pale skin drawing every eye as the guests stepped back to let him pass. He stopped right in front of Audrey, who was just rising from the bench, her brown eyes meeting his dark ones without any fear or hesitation. He looked down at her for a long moment, the entire room going quiet again as they watched the master of Coldwater Hall confront the quiet girl in black. Nicholas reached out his cold, pale hand, took Audrey's right hand in his own, and raised it slowly to his white lips, kissing the back of her fingers in front of the 300 witnesses. The ballroom did not shout this time, but instead let out a collective, quiet gasp as they realized what the master's gesture meant in the language of high society. A noble kissing the hand of a poor orphan, in such a public and deliberate manner, was an official declaration of his interest and protection, a sign that Audrey Finch was no longer a person who could be ignored or treated like a servant. Audrey felt the intense cold of his skin against her fingers, but beneath the frost she felt a strange, steady strength that made her heart beat with a sudden confidence. She looked into his dark eyes and whispered her thanks, her voice steady enough for him to hear over the murmurs of the crowd. Henry Collins, the old diplomat, who had spent his life studying the history of the old families of New England, moved through the crowd toward the piano as Nicholas stepped back. Henry removed his spectacles, wiped them with his silk handkerchief, and looked at Audrey with a look of profound respect that made Blair Harrington turn away in disgust. He asked Audrey where she had found that particular piece of music, his voice trembling slightly with an emotion he could not entirely hide. When Audrey replied that she had found it in an old red book in the north wing, Henry let out a long breath and turned to look at the white-haired master who stood nearby. Henry told the nearby guests that the song was a sacred piece of the Drake family history, written by the master's own grandfather over 200 years ago as a gift for his bride, before they crossed the ocean to America. He stated that the music had been believed lost in a great fire during the previous century, and that nobody alive had expected to hear its notes played again in this house. He looked at Audrey and noted that her own father had been a corresponding member of the old musical societies, a man who had known the old texts better than anyone else in the country, which explained how his daughter had been able to understand the complex notation so perfectly. Lady Gable and Blair Harrington left the ballroom before the clock struck midnight, their carriages driving down the dark avenue of oak trees in a complete silence that showed their utter defeat. The stories of that night spread through the town of Newport within 24 hours, carried by the servants and the wealthy guests, who could talk about nothing else at their morning tea tables. Audrey remained at Coldwater Hall at the master's personal request, moving out of her small third-floor room into a large suite in the west wing that had tall windows facing the southern sun. She was no longer required to carry silver or pine branches, but instead spent her days in the restored music room, where the gray linen sheets had been removed from the grand piano forever. Nicholas came to see her every afternoon after the sun had gone down, sitting in the old velvet chair by the window while she played the old songs her father had taught her. They did not speak much at first, but over the weeks, the silence between them grew warm and comfortable, like the silence between two old friends who had no need for empty words. Nicholas told her about his long life in the cold stone house, explaining how the white hair and pale skin were the marks of an ancient lineage that had watched the world change from the shadows for centuries. He spoke of his loneliness without any self-pity, describing how the music had brought a small piece of light back into a house that had been dark for 40 years. Audrey listened to his stories without any fear, her gentle fingers resting on the keys as she looked at his pale face in the firelight. She found that beneath his cold exterior and his terrifying reputation, Nicholas was a man of great kindness, who had spent his long life protecting his people and his estate from the cruelty of the outside world. He did not eat the food the servants prepared or walk in the bright light of the noon sun, but he cared for the small children of the village and made sure that no family on his land went hungry during the hard winter months. She realized that she had found the first person who truly understood the music in her heart, and she knew she did not want to return to Lady Gable's house. In the first week of March, when the snow was beginning to melt from the edges of the cliffs, Nicholas asked Audrey to be his wife while they were standing on the stone terrace, looking out at the dark ocean. He did not offer her a conventional speech about wealth or position, but instead told her that his long, cold life had been completely changed by the sound of her music through the wooden door of the north wing. He stated that he could not imagine the rest of his centuries without her beside him, and he asked her to share his home and his dark kingdom as his equal. Audrey looked into his dark eyes, felt the cold wind from the sea against her face, and said yes without a single doubt in her heart. They were married in the small stone chapel at the edge of the estate on a quiet Tuesday morning, with only Iris Campbell and Arthur Pendleton there to witness their vows. Arthur delivered a short speech during the breakfast, that made Nicholas laugh aloud for the first time. In 30 years, a deep, clear sound that made the old servants smile as they carried the tea into the dining room. Polly Kent was made Audrey's personal maid with a salary that allowed her to buy a small house for her mother in the village, and she spent her mornings singing the old songs Audrey had taught her, while she brushed out the Duchess's brown hair. In the autumn of the following year, Audrey gave birth to a daughter with gray eyes like her father and long, gentle fingers that were always reaching for the white keys of the piano. They named her Eleanor, and by the time she was 3 years old, she would sit on the leather bench beside her mother for hours, listening to the old handwritten pieces without making a single sound. Nicholas would stand in the shadow of the doorway watching them, his white hair catching the golden light of the late afternoon sun, as he held his daughter's small, warm hand in his own pale fingers. The Drake estate became a center of music and learning for the entire region, as Audrey opened a small academy in the village for the children of the fishermen and the laborers who could not afford proper teachers. The master funded the school completely, buying 2 good pianos from the city and hiring a young teacher from Boston to help Audrey with the daily lessons. The school grew from 6 students in the first year to 24 by the third, and Audrey felt a deep sense of pride when 3 of her regular village boys won positions in the grand orchestras of the big cities. Henry Collins visited the academy during its second winter, bringing with him an official letter from the musical societies of Europe that recognized Audrey's father as one of the great private composers of his generation. Audrey took the paper, her brown eyes filling with tears as she read the words her father had waited his whole life to hear, knowing that his name was finally safe in the old books where it belonged. She thanked the old diplomat for his help and carried the paper up to her room, placing it inside the dark red leather book that had started her entire journey in the cold rooms of Coldwater Hall. The winter wind still makes a loud, whistling sound through the old oak trees of the avenue, but the inside of Coldwater Hall remains warm and bright with the light of dozens of candles every evening. Audrey sits at the grand piano in the north wing, her fingers moving softly over the keys as she plays a quiet melody for her sleeping daughter in the next room. She looks out the tall windows at the dark ocean and the white foam of the waves against the gray cliffs, feeling a deep, quiet peace that she had never known during her long years in Lady Gable's crowded parlor. She knows that her choice to play the forbidden song was the truest thing she had ever done, and that the world had kept its promise to those who had the courage to speak in their own voice. As she looks toward the future, Audrey finds herself thinking about the long years that lie ahead for her and the white-haired man who stands in the shadow of the terrace door. She knows that his life is different from the lives of mortal men, measured in centuries rather than short years, and that she will eventually grow old while his pale face remains unchanged by the passage of time. Yet, this knowledge does not bring her any fear or sadness, because she understands that the love they have built between them is like the ancient music in the red leather book, something that does not depend on the short seasons of the world to keep its strength. Their connection was not formed by the passing beauty of youth or the polite rules of high society, but by a shared understanding of loneliness, memory, and the quiet truth that lives in the dark spaces of the heart. She sees her daughter Eleanor growing up in these wide stone halls, learning the old songs and bringing her own warmth to a house that had been frozen for so long. The academy in the village will continue to teach the children of the poor, ensuring that the music her father loved will live on in the voices of new generations long after her own hands have left the keys. Nicholas steps into the room, his cold hand resting gently on her shoulder as he listens to the final notes of her song, his dark eyes full of a quiet devotion that is more valuable to her than all the gold in the great cities. They will face the long winters together, keeping their fire burning in the dark stone house by the sea. And she knows that as long as they have the music, they will never be alone in the shadows again.